In the midst of the Dust Bowl, when every breath felt like swallowing dust, a mechanic named Jesse Cole had an idea that would seem as foolish as the wind was relentless. His plan to make engines run on corn gas would not only challenge the status quo but could mean survival for countless families if only he could prove it. Before we dive into Jesse's incredible journey, tell us where you're watching from, and if tales of innovation against all odds resonate with you, hit subscribe, because tomorrow's story might just fuel your future. It was the summer of 1934 when the storm of dust first hit Jesse Cole's small garage in the heart of the Dust Bowl. For weeks, the wind hadn't stopped, turning the ground into a barren wasteland. It whipped through the trees, carried by endless gusts, and filled the air with the stifling scent of earth. The world seemed to shrink each time a new storm rolled in. The parched crops had failed, the roads were nearly impassable, under the weight of dirt, and most of Jesse's fellow farmers had already given up. But Jesse never considered quitting. He had a stubborn streak that ran deeper than the drought itself. As a mechanic, he'd always found solace in machines. Engines were dependable, steadfast in a way that people never seemed to be. At least, that was the case before the dust had come. The machines that powered the farms, trucks, and even the few remaining trains had begun to break down. The fuel supply was low, and the government's rationing system didn't help. Gasoline was hard to come by, and the prices were impossible for most families to afford. Jesse stood outside his garage, squinting into the clouded horizon as he wiped his dirty hands on his grease-streaked overalls. The town had practically emptied out, with everyone moving west in search of something better. But Jesse wasn't about to pack up his shop and leave. He had a plan, a crazy one, as some called it, but a plan nonetheless. He was staring at his workbench, lined with metal tools, pistons, and a battered old engine that he had pulled from a tractor. There, amidst the scattered parts, was the answer he'd been hunting for. Corn. The farmers had plenty of it. They could no longer depend on the land to grow the crops they needed to survive, but the one thing they had left was corn. And corn, Jesse thought, might be just the answer. If we can't get gasoline, maybe we make our own, he mumbled to himself. Corn gas. It wasn't an entirely new idea. There were whispers among the farmers about distilling corn into fuel, but most of them dismissed it as fantasy. No one had ever done it before, not in the way Jesse was thinking. It was risky, but then again, so was staying put. With the town's farms failing and no gasoline to power the engines, his idea might be the only way to keep them running. As he wiped his brow, Jesse made up his mind. He would build the prototype, test it, and prove that it could work. He didn't know how, but he had nothing left to lose. If he failed, it would just be another small disaster in a life filled with too many. But if it worked, it could change everything. Jesse worked through the night, the sounds of his hammer and wrench echoing in the small garage. His fingers were raw, the air thick with the smell of metal, gasoline, and sweat. The engine sat before him like a challenge, each piece needing his full attention. He worked in silence, the rest of the world outside his door forgotten. There were no more neighbors to stop by, no one to ask for help, but Jesse didn't mind. This was his battle, and he was determined to win it. The corn gas was something he'd read about in books, old pamphlets left behind by government workers, some from as far back as World War I. It wasn't a new fuel, but in the face of the Dust Bowl, it had never been more relevant. The process was simple enough. Ferment the corn into alcohol and convert it into fuel for internal combustion engines. But Jesse knew better than most that simplicity could be deceiving. He pulled the corn kernels from a nearby bag, staring at them as if they held the future of the community within their humble, yellow husks. The process would take time, days, maybe weeks, but the world didn't have weeks. Every day that passed without progress brought them closer to losing everything. "All right, let's see what you can do," he muttered to the engine as he began the first distillation. It wasn't until the first batch was ready that he could truly test his idea. The process had taken longer than expected. There were a few kinks, like the smell of the fermented mash that nearly sent him running, but he wasn't about to back down now. The fuel sat in a glass jar, its amber color a sign of its potency. The moment of truth came at dawn. The first test engine, a small tractor engine, rumbled to life in the garage. Jesse had hooked it up to a set of makeshift pipes, and a fuel tank he'd scavenged from an old truck. The engine sputtered for a moment, then began to hum, a steady, persistent hum that Jesse hadn't heard in weeks. For a long moment, Jesse just stood there, wide-eyed, his hands still gripping the wrench. The engine, powered by nothing but his corn fuel, was running. His heart raced, a mixture of relief and disbelief flooding through him. The fuel worked. He'd done it. Jesse wiped his hands on his overalls and smiled. It wasn't much, just a single engine running on corn gas, but it was enough. It was proof. Proof that he had what the rest of the town needed. It was time to share this with them. Time to show them that despite the dust, despite the hardship, there was still hope. Word of Jesse Cole's crazy idea spread faster than the dust storms themselves. At first, people were skeptical. They'd heard about experimental fuels before, and most of them had never amounted to much. But this was different. Jesse wasn't selling a theory or a pipe dream, he was offering proof. A tractor engine, humming with the power of corn gas, sat in the middle of town like a beacon of hope. It didn't take long before farmers, mechanics, and neighbors came out of the woodwork, curious to see for themselves if the fuel really worked. Some were silent, watching the engine with suspicion. Others were eager to learn, their hands itching to try it for themselves. Jesse stood by his makeshift contraption, waiting for the inevitable questions to come. "You really think corn gas can replace the real stuff?" Ben Harper, a longtime farmer, asked as he approached, his boots crunching in the snow. His face was weathered, the kind of face that had seen more than its fair share of hardship. Jesse looked up at Ben, his eyes hard with resolve. "I don't think it can. I know it can. I've seen it work. You've seen it work." Ben didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced at the engine, then back to Jesse, as if weighing the risks against the possible reward. "Now I ain't a fool," Ben said slowly. "But I'll be damned if we don't need something to keep these tractors running. If you can make this work on a larger scale, Jesse, I reckon you'll have more than just a mechanic shop. You'll have a lifeline for this whole town." Jesse nodded, feeling a sense of quiet pride in the farmer's words. It wasn't just about engines, it was about survival. It was about the town pulling itself from the jaws of despair, one small victory at a time. That afternoon, Jesse gathered the handful of farmers and their families at the town hall. He'd spent the morning preparing his pitch, but when he stepped up to the podium, the weight of what he was about to do hit him all at once. This wasn't just a demonstration, this was a gamble. If he failed, the town would lose more than trust. They'd lose any remaining hope. The room was silent, save for the soft hiss of the heater at the Public.com. Back. Jesse cleared his throat. "What I'm offering you is a way to keep your engines running when the gas dries up. Corn gas isn't the answer to everything, but it's a way to keep the plows moving, the trucks running, and maybe keep this town from sinking any deeper into the dust." He paused. "I'm not asking you to follow me blindly, I'm asking you to trust your own eyes." With that, he gestured to the corner of the room, where a small engine, now fully converted, sat. Ben Harper stepped forward first, his face unreadable. He reached out and turned the key. The engine sputtered, then roared to life, its hum filling the room with a sound that hadn't been heard in months. A murmur spread through the crowd, a blend of disbelief and awe. The engine wasn't just running, it was running smoothly. Jesse could feel the weight of their gazes, the shift in the air, as hope began to take root. For the first time, in what felt like years, there was something tangible to cling to. "I can't promise you a miracle," Jesse said, his voice firm. "But if this works for you, it's yours to use. All I ask is that we stick together. We need each other now more than ever." The room remained silent for a moment longer, and then, one by one, the farmers began nodding, their faces softening. This wasn't just about engines, it was about resilience, about finding a way to survive, together. By the time spring arrived, the town had begun to change. Jesse's corn gas wasn't just an alternative fuel, it had become a lifeline. One by one, the farmers converted their tractors, trucks, and even the old harvester machines. The first full harvest of the year wasn't as large as it should have been, but it was enough to keep the wheels turning, to keep the town alive. Jesse stood outside his shop one afternoon, watching as Ben Harper and his sons worked on converting another engine. The farm had been slow to adapt, but now that the fuel worked, they were catching up. The sound of the engines running through the fields was a promise of a future, a quiet symphony against the winds that still blew relentlessly across the plains. There were still challenges ahead. The dust storms hadn't stopped, and the drought had only deepened its grip on the land. Yet, the farmers who had once given up or fled had stayed, their faith in something simple yet extraordinary restoring their sense of community. It wasn't just the engines that were running now, it was the people. They worked together, fueled by a shared purpose. Jesse wasn't just a mechanic anymore, he had become a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the worst of times, innovation could still carve a path forward. But not everyone was on board. A handful of the more established farmers still held on to their skepticism, refusing to give up their old ways. They mocked Jesse's fuel, calling it nothing more than a pipe dream. To them, the idea of running their engines on corn gas was laughable until the storms hit again. By the time summer rolled around, the town was buzzing with activity. The engines were still running, but the fuel wasn't without its struggles. Jesse had to find ways to make the distillation process faster, more efficient, and less reliant on the scarce resources they still had left. One night, he stayed up late, running tests and making notes. The workshop was quiet, save for the occasional clink of metal as he tightened a bolt or adjusted the carburetor. His hands were shaking from exhaustion, but his mind raced with ideas. He could do this. They could do this. There had to be a way to make this fuel work on a larger scale, to help not just his town, but the entire region. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in years, Jesse didn't feel like he was alone. He was part of something larger, something that couldn't be stopped, not by dust, not by the weather, and not by those who still doubted. Tomorrow's another day, Jesse muttered, looking out at the fields where the engines hummed in the distance. And tomorrow, we'll be ready. The fight wasn't over, but with the right fuel and the right spirit, there was nothing they couldn't face together. By the time the first frost of winter settled on the town, Jesse Cole's corn gas had become a cornerstone of survival. The engines, once powered by dwindling supplies of gasoline, now ran on the very thing the farmers had almost given up on: corn. Fields that had once been barren had come back to life, and despite the harshest conditions, the town had found a rhythm again. Jesse had done more than invent a new fuel. He had given the town a reason to hope, a reason to stay. The seed of his idea had spread beyond his small shop, taking root in neighboring towns and even catching the attention of a few government officials who saw its potential. It wasn't long before others were testing the same methods, building on the foundation Jesse had laid. But Jesse never saw himself as a hero. He never sought fame or recognition. He was just a mechanic who wanted to make things work, to fix what was broken. As he stood outside his shop one crisp evening, watching the first snowflakes fall, he couldn't help but smile. The engines in the distance were still running, just as they had the season before, and the town was still standing. His work was far from over. There were improvements to be made, new challenges to overcome. But Jesse had learned something important. It wasn't just about the fuel, it was about the people. When they pulled together, when they believed in something more than just survival, they could weather any storm. As he walked into his shop to close up for the night, Jesse looked at the engines, the corn, and the town. He knew this wasn't the end, it was just the beginning.